have is from verse 3 through verse 20, we have people who are arranged by family. We have in verses 21 through 35, we have people who are arranged by city. I mean, look at the first one in verse 21. The first city is Bethlehem, which obviously is a critical city for biblical history. And what I assume happened is that the Babylonians came in and they took these people in these different cities and they kept them in one group and they took them into exile. And in exile, these people had nothing else to hold on to except their faith in God and the people that they grew up with in their little cities. So they stayed in their little kind of city group, and then when they returned back in their city group. Okay, all the people, hey, we're the Bethlehem group. We came from Bethlehem, and we're going back to Bethlehem. We want to go back to that area to repopulate that city. And we only come to find out later on how important it was that they did that. That there was a city there in the little town of Bethlehem. Verses 36 through 58. Verse 36 through 58 lists large groups of people again, not just for rebuilding the temple. In fact, I have a little note on this for you, note number 2. Not just for rebuilding the temple, but for creating a religious infrastructure to reestablish the temple system as the core of Jewish society. There was adequate religious infrastructure of priests who composed about a tenth of the returnees. So there's about 4,000 priests that came back. There's 42,000 total population that came back. So about 10% of those who returned were priests. There were Levites, there were singers, there were temple servants, there were Solomon's servants, there were gatekeepers. We'll go through each of these groups, or most of these groups individually. But what was their goal? When they thought about reestablishing their society, they were talking about reestablishing the priesthood, the Levitical system, the sacrificial system, ultimately their worship system that brought them closer as a society to God. And you know what? That takes a lot of people. Ministry takes a lot of people. And this was their focus, on reestablishing the Levitical, the worship system, and reestablishing right relationship with God. Several of these groups are mentioned along the way. Verse 40, he begins to list, in verse 36, he begins to list the priests. In verse 40, he begins to list the Levites. And as you recall, not all priests are Levites. The Levites are from the tribe of Levi, but the priests come from one of the descendants of Levi, namely, you remember who? Aaron, that's right. Okay, so all the Levites, Moses was a Levite, but his brother Aaron was assigned to be the beginning of what they call the Aaronic priesthood. And so there were priests, and there were also the broader category of Levites from the tribe of Levi, who also assisted with the religious functions of the society. You have in verse 43 this group, the temple servants. And the temple servants is very interesting. It's the word Nethanim, which is, they are mentioned in verse 43, they're mentioned again in verse 48, they're mentioned again, in 58, they're mentioned in verse 70. So these temple servants were very critical to what was going on. Ezra, chapter 8, let's flip ahead to chapter 8. Verse 20, talks about these temple servants. Mentions 220 of the temple servants whom David and the princes had given for service of Levites, all of them designated by name. So this class of people, this group of people, probably not themselves Levites, but they were tasked by David to help with the temple. And you think, wait a minute, David didn't build the temple. No, he didn't build the temple, and you remember why. He's living in his palace, and he looks around, and then he looks out his window and he sees the tabernacle, and it's all tattered and kind of old. And David says, you know what? I need to build a house for the Lord. I need to build a temple for the Lord. And he gets this idea in his mind, and he's all excited about this until Prophet Nathan says, you know what? You're not the guy that God has chosen. You have too much blood on your hands. Your son will build the temple for the Lord, and not David. And I'm sure this was kind of discouraging for David, but it didn't stop David from helping Solomon. In fact, we're going to see this in the next chapter. He starts ordering materials for Solomon. He doesn't build the temple, but he starts ordering materials, and apparently he starts arranging a group of people who will help with the temple ministry. And you think, boy, you've got all these priests, you have all these Levites, and yet David still saw fit. We need another group of people to help with what happens in ministry. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. A lot of people were needed for the ministry of the temple service. And we keep going, and then in verse 55, we get to another group of people, the sons of Solomon's servants. And we're wondering, who is this group of people? Well, apparently, Solomon's servants may have been an additional group of people who, after the temple was built, were assigned to help David's assigned temple servants and the Levites and the priests. So now we have 4 groups of people who have been assigned to help with the spiritual benefit of the nation of Israel. We have the priests, the Levites, David's temple servants that he assigned, and Solomon's servants that he assigned to also help with the temple. Can we just stop a minute and think, wow, that's a lot of people. There are times in Israel's history where something needed to be done, and it was done miraculously, and God just made it happen. It was miraculous. But that's generally not the way God worked in the Old Testament. Generally not the way God works in the New Testament. God seems to prefer to work in what we might call non-miraculous ways through a large group of His people who are faithful to Him, who are desiring to set out on new beginnings as these people were, and who want to serve Him wholeheartedly. Not perfect people, not flawless people, but people who are concerned about their own spirituality, who are concerned about God's priorities, putting God's priorities above personal preferences and personal priorities, and who want to strive to see God's goals accomplished. That takes a lot of people. Well, what we see then as we go into verse 59 is that there are people of uncertain genealogy. So let me read verse 59 through verse 63 for us. Now these are those who came up from Tel Melah, Tel Harsha, Cherub, Adon, and Immer. But they were not able to give evidence of their fathers' households and of their descendants, whether they were of Israel. The sons of Deliah, the sons of Tobiah, the sons of Nekoda. Of the sons of the priests, the sons Haggai, the sons of Hakaz, and the sons of Barzillai, who took a wife from the daughter of Barzillai, and Gedaliah. You understand why I didn't want to read the entire chapter, but we'll continue to read this. And Gedaliah, and he was called by their name. These searched among their ancestral registration, but they could not be located. Therefore, they were considered unclean and excluded from the priesthood. The governor said to them that they should not eat from the most holy things until a priest stood up with the Urim and Thummim. A couple of interesting things here that I want to point out to you. This list reflects a group of people whose genealogy is uncertain. Again, in the post-exilic community, genealogy was critical. Making sure you could trace your lineage back to one of the tribes of Israel was critical, especially if you wanted to be a priest, and that's what we see here. There's some problems with that. So in some of these special cases, people were excluded from the priesthood, but they were still allowed to remain with the community. And I think there's an interesting thing that can be said about how there's an inclusion with God's people and an exclusion as well. Once some of the priestly functions were reestablished, there was a chance that some of these people, if they had a chance to identify their genealogy, they could be admitted into the community on genealogical grounds, but also readmitted to the priesthood. But they were not just thrown in there, they had to wait, they had to go through certain steps before that was made possible. Now, these were not excessive precautions. We might look at this and say, oh, come on, if they want to be a priest, let them be a priest. Well, they can't do that. The law of Moses did not allow them to do that. It was God's word that certain people were designated as priests, certain people were designated as Levites, and that's what God's law was. There was nothing exclusivistic about that. That's just the way truth works. That's the way God's law works. You know, we sometimes come across someone who says, oh, your Christianity is so exclusivistic. It has to be through Jesus Christ, and He's the only way, and the only truth, and the only life. And we say, yeah, I'm sorry, that is the way it is. I don't really care if you like it or not. Whether you like it or not is, let me put this nicely, completely irrelevant. Whether I prefer that method to another method means nothing. The reality is that salvation is by Christ, through Christ alone. There is no other way to the Father, because God's word says so. And I really don't care how condemnatory or how derisive or divisive that makes us look, or how naive that makes us look. That's the way it is. Whether people appreciate that, accept it, or not. In the same way, some people were readmitted back into the priesthood once their genealogical line could be traced. And some people were excluded from the priesthood because of that. You know what? It's okay to be exclusivistic. If you get into a discussion, you know, someone, you know, beats, oh, you're not tolerant, you just want to push everybody else out. Don't back down from that. Say, no, this is not my law, this is not my preference, this is what the Bible says, and that's all that matters. You just simply cannot have eternal life, salvation from sin, forgiveness for the past deeds that we have done, and even the future ones that we will do. We cannot have that without Christ. Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, all these minor cults that are running around, there's no other way to heaven other than through Christ. Don't apologize for that at all. These were not excessive precautions that the post-exilic community is taking here in verses 62 and 63. This is their attempt to realign themselves with Mosaic law. And we get hints as we go through the period of history before the exile that Mosaic law was not held up very highly. That different offices, including priestly offices, were bought and sold. That some of these commandments were not held to very strictly. The post-exilic community wants to do it right. They want to do it by the book. They're not trying to be creative about it. They're not trying to bring in their ideas, their laws, their preferences, their traditions. They want to do it right according to God's word. And we commend them for that. We want to emulate that in our own lives. We want to do things right according to God's word. There are standards, there is objectivity, and we want to live our lives in line with that. Verse 64, we'll kind of wrap this chapter up here in the next few minutes. Verse 64 gives us the total number of returnees as well as the servants, some animals that returned with them. Between the people listed in verse 59 and 60 and some of these servants that are listed in verse 65, I can't help but wonder if some of these people aren't proselytes. Okay, the Jewish people are taken out of their homeland and they're dumped into this foreign land, and they have a strong idea that, you know what God said happened. God said that if we are unfaithful to Him, He will take us out of our land. And they tell this to people. They say, you know, this is why we're here. We're here because we have a great supreme sovereign God who oversees the kings rather of all nations, who is better than any god that any nation worships. And because we were faithful to Him, we're not here because the Babylonian king is stronger than or the Babylonian god is stronger than our God. You know, in ancient times, when one country conquers another, it's because their god was stronger than the other god. It's a little bit of a, you know, my dad can beat up your dad sort of thing. But that was their mentality. And they're with all these other people that had been taken captive from all these other lands. And they say, well, I guess our God was not as strong as the Babylonian God. And the Israelites say, no. That's not how it works. We know our God is the only God, the one God, the true God. We're not here because our God wasn't strong enough. We're here because we weren't following him strongly enough. We're not here because he was not faithful.